You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Noticed anything about churches in America? In a lot of places, they're boarded up, converted to some other use, or just abandoned, left to let nature get to work. What some scholars are calling the Great De-Churching is already well underway. America is getting less religious, and the exodus is accelerating. A half-century ago, about 90% of Americans were Christian. A half-century from now, that share could be as little as 30%. Christianity takes up a lot of space in U.S. media, but its decline shouldn't be surprising. Rich industrialized countries like Britain and Germany saw a steep drop-off in churchgoers nearly a century ago. What is remarkable here is the speed, with a rapid and steady downward trend, especially among young adults. And that got me to thinking about why this is happening and where it takes us.
It's just hard to get motivated on a Sunday when you've got, 8 people and 2 of them fall asleep and one of them's you.
Ryan Burge was the pastor at a Baptist church in Mount Vernon, Illinois, for about 17 years. And he spends a lot of time thinking about why so many churches are closing here in this country.
What I tell people is what I'm doing here is not just some cold academic exercise. It reflected what I saw in the pews every Sunday. My pews were emptying out between 2006 and 2024.
He's a professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University and a self-styled numbers guy. Ryan collects a lot of data about religion in America and charts his findings in a Substack called Graphs About Religion. He explores questions like, are religious people more fearful? And do you believe in miracles? But Ryan's most notable graph may be one of his earliest. How many nuns are there? Nuns. That's the term social scientists use to describe people who are non-religious. Ryan's work about the nuns, who they are and where they're going, strikes at the heart of a project we've been working on for the last year. It's an audio documentary series called The Final Service. In it, we set out to answer a really big question in 4 parts. What does a community lose when a church closes its doors for good? And how will the ones that survive manage to keep them open? We called up Ryan to help us find out. I can't tell anymore. Now being north of 60 and I can see 70 on the horizon, I can't tell how old anybody is anymore. So how old are you? And would you have grown up at a time when things were different?
I'm 42 years old. I was born in 1982. So I actually grew up in a youth group, evangelical youth group in the 1990s, which data-wise, that was the peak of American evangelicalism. They rose to 30% in 1993 and were above 25% for basically all of my childhood. And they're around 17% today. So I kind of grew up in this evangelical bubble where it was evangelicalism was this all-consuming culture, where it was music, it was T-shirts, it was books. And there were Christian bookstores on every corner, it felt like. There were 30 or 40 music festivals across America. There was all Christian music. You could literally live like in this evangelical ecosystem. There were camps and there were retreats and there were trainings and there were all these things. And it seems like it was much more unified than it is today. Evangelicalism is much more fragmented on a whole bunch of lines, not just, theological, but also racial and regional and age-wise. So I don't know if I would have been born earlier or later if I would have done what I did in life.
But you got to see, it's fair to say, part of the golden age, if we could call it that, the high cry before things started to change. Some people might even argue unravel. Apart from that wider cultural footprint and that obvious presence in the culture, what was it like at the neighborhood level? What was it like at the congregational level?
Yeah, so it felt like every need you had could be met by the congregation. If you needed a car dealer, we had a car dealer. If you had an insurance salesman, you had an insurance salesman. You needed an optometrist, you had an optometrist. Or a veterinarian, you had one of those. It was like you had this built-in like extended family, that went just beyond your blood relatives to like all these people who knew you and cared about you and wanted to see you succeed. And if you stumbled, they would help you financially and spiritually and socially and all those things. It felt like evangelicalism ran the culture in some ways. Everyone else was a minority and we were the majority. And so what we said went, and how we voted swayed elections. But also, interestingly enough, looking back on that now, like we weren't as politically divided as we are now in terms of who we voted for. Like my first election was in 2000. It was Bush v. Gore. And in my little county in rural Illinois, it was almost 50-50 Bush v. Gore. And now it's 75-25. And I know my church was not 80% Republicans back in those days. It was decidedly conservative, especially on social issues like abortion and same-sex marriage and things like that. But there were a lot of people who voted for Democrats, evangelicals in the 1990s. So I think, to say that we were like politically unified was not true. We actually were very politically diverse. And I actually don't remember politics being discussed that much, from the pulpit especially, but also from the pews. Like it was just sort of a thing that you didn't talk about in those days. We just sort of assumed that you were a conservative. So I think the kind of evangelicalism we have to now is much more politically homogenous than evangelicalism was when I was growing up.
That world you describe of growing up at a time of congregational sufficiency, it led you to the pulpit, but many of your peers, it would look from the numbers, headed out the door. They didn't not only not become pastors, they didn't even become adult churchgoers. What happened?
Yeah, so millennials, about 40% of them are non-religious today, which is obviously a dramatic rise. If you actually look in the data, the period between 1991 and 1998 was incredibly important. It's really, we're living in the residue of what happened there. The share of young people who identified as Christians dropped by 12 points in 8 years. Between 1991 and 1998. So we actually were seeing the first fruits of like the secularization, the rise of the nuns happening in the 1990s. And so we're sort of living with the fact now a lot of people are non-religious and they're raising children to be non-religious too because they're non-religious. There was a lot of things that happened, though, as evangelicalism was at this peak, the foundation was crumbling underneath us, and a couple things happened there. One, politics got a whole lot more divisive in the 1990s. If you look back prior to that, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill were Democrat and Republican. They golfed together. And then you saw Newt Gingrich, who basically became a bomb thrower, and said the way we're going to defeat the Democrats in Congress is by telling people they're evil. And it worked. They won their majority in 1994. And so politics got more divisive. The rise of the internet, we can't, underestimate like the fact that you could go online now and find every problem with your religion in a few clicks. You used to be able to go to the library and go to the card catalog and like sort through books and things like that. And so I think it opened us up in a way to a whole different world. We were like the transitional generation millennials are. We grew up non-digital and then became digital in our teens and in our college years. And I think as all that was shifting, we also saw that white Christianity began to become increasingly more Republican. And so for anyone who was independent or left of center, they looked at Christianity and said, wait, there used to be a place for me in this world, and now there's really no place for me in this world anymore. And so I think it was like this confluence of all these events at one time led us away from church.
But people who were coming to adulthood around the turn of the century didn't say, significantly, let's just make a thing that does reflect what we want from church. They bailed out altogether. Why did that happen?
Yeah, I think that actually might be the million-dollar question in my line of work. There used to be this great tradition in America called the Main Line, which is United Methodist, Episcopalians, United Church of Christ, American Baptist. They were churches that believed in Jesus and preached the gospel, but definitely were dogmatic on issues like female pastors or same-sex marriage or abortion. They used to be half of America in the 1950s, and now they're less than 10% of America, and they're going very quickly towards zero. I mean, the average mainline Protestant now is over 60 years old. So the question we always ask ourselves is, if I grew up evangelical and liked Jesus but didn't like the politics, why didn't a lot of people become mainline? And the answer, I think, is a lot of them walked into a mainline church and looked around and saw a lot of gray-haired people and went, ooh, I'm 35 and these people were 65. I mean, even the church that I took over in 2006, I was 24 years old and the youngest person in the congregation was 55. So there's this huge age gap, and I don't know if I wasn't a pastor, if I would have walked in that church, I would have been there one Sunday and not come back. because I wanted to be around people, my age and my worldview and coming from my background. So I think a lot of young people would have liked to go to a more moderate church, a more open church, a more welcoming church. But when they walked in those churches, they saw a bunch of people who looked nothing like them and thought, I can't hang around with my grandparents on Sunday morning, and they left.
You took on a church in the American Baptist fold. From what you tell me, the signs of decay were already well established by the time you became a pastor. Did you have a sense of that when you took on that vocation, that you would be trying to lift a really heavy load over your head?
Yeah, I think when I took over, I didn't fully understand the scope and scale of what I was facing. When you're young and idealistic, you don't think about things like that. But I've been on staff of 3 churches now, and 2 of the 3 don't exist anymore. The one I just pastored closed in July. The one I pastored before that closed a few years ago. And the first church I was youth pastor at had 150 people when I was there, and now it's down to 30 or 35 on a Sunday. So it looks like they're going to close in the next 5 to 10 years as well. There's this old John Wesley quote, if you set yourself on fire, people will come to watch you burn. And I really believe that. Like, if I really preached well enough and I served well enough and I pastored well enough, that I could revitalize any congregation, no matter the circumstance or the situation or the age gap or the community or whatever it was. And I think part of what my career is about is trying to basically convince myself that it's not all my fault. These churches closing were part of a larger shift in American culture, and it was 2 things happening at once. One is I live in a declining part of America, population-wise. I mean, in 1950, my county had about 36,000 people. In 2020, had 36,000 people. The number of Americans doubled. My county stayed the exact same size. So it's hard to grow a church in a declining county, but it's also hard to grow a mainline church anywhere in America, let alone a declining county. There's so many things stacked against these churches that once you get below a certain threshold, it's almost impossible to come back from that. And so eventually what I convinced myself of, or tried to at least, was I was a hospice pastor. My job was to see this church through to the end, no matter how that looked. And I think there's a huge need in America. I mean, would it be fun to be part of a growing church? Absolutely. I don't even know what that's like. I've never been part of that in my life. I would love to be part of that, but I also realize there's a lot of people who are going to churches and have been going to churches for 50 or 60 years who need a pastor to see them through their last days of life, to help bury their spouse and help bury them and help preach that Sunday sermon and give communion. So I think there's, I always tell pastors that God called you to be faithful, not successful. And I think what God called me to was to be, a pastor of declining churches. And I think a lot more churches are going to be in the same situation that we were in.
So is there a gracious way to do, it sounds like you're suggesting there is a gracious way to do managed decline that's not defeatist, but it's what's called for at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, dying well. At the end for us, our big thing was if we closed down, would anyone outside our church walls really care? And about 10 years ago, we said no, they wouldn't, because we were only really serving ourselves at that point. And so we started a program where we fed kids in the public school system over the weekends, gave them a brown bag of food on Friday afternoon. They took it home and ate it Saturday and Sunday because we were being told by the social workers these kids were going hungry over the weekend because the school lunch program didn't provide them anything. 85% of kids in our community were on free or reduced lunch. And we thought that's a tragedy. Like in America, we can't feed hungry kids. So we started packing bags. We thought we were going to, 30 bags. That was our goal, 30 bags a week. And there were some years we did 265 bags a week. The money never stopped. People kept giving money. Eventually, it was the work that became the hard part, the actual packing of the bags and logistics of all that, not the money. And I'll tell you, our biggest fear at the end was who's going to take over the brown bag program? Like who's going to carry on this ministry that we were doing to the community? And luckily, we found the Ministerial Alliance stepped up. Actually, our last check we wrote was the remainder of our balance from our general fund to the brown bag program for the Ministerial Alliance because we wanted that legacy to carry on far beyond the building and the people and the church and all those things. And we're really happy to hear they continue to do the program every week.
Was there a point where you thought, maybe I can turn this around? And if I just get it to this imaginary number or that imaginary number, we can pay for the heat, we can keep the building maintained, maybe I'll even get a little bit of a salary. Was there a point where you still believed there's some life in the old gal yet and I can do this?
Yeah, for the first couple of years, I will say that I was optimistic. I mean, I thought we were only 2 or 3 families away from turning things around. Especially young families with children. Because if you only have 40 or 50 people, if you add 4 families and they each have 2 kids, now you've got 65 or 70 on a Sunday. And it feels like now if younger families do come, then they can look around and go, hey, there's something here. There's a green shoot that we could use to grow with. But I mean, eventually what you realize is that, a young couple comes in, they look around and they come for one Sunday and don't come back. And I had many of them tell them, Ryan, I love your preaching and I love all that stuff. I just can't find the community that I'm looking for in the congregation. And you know what? I can't blame them. They're at-will people here. They self-select into religion. They chose to come to my church one Sunday. And so after about 5 or 7 years, we moved from, if we're going to fix this thing, to how do we decline in a way that's meaningful? How do we get rid of the building? How do we give away choir robes and hymnals and lecterns and pulpits and communion tables and all those logistical things? And I think we really, in true Midwestern style, we didn't look at the big picture. We just thought about what the problem that was right in front of us was. And so we started managing the problems that were right in front of us. And the unspoken thing was we were gonna die. The church was gonna close, but no one said that. And eventually, I think we got to the point where we're like, okay, let's have a big conversation. That was how to get rid of the building. Then it was the next conversation, which is how to get rid of the brown bag program. And then it was, when are we gonna close?
A couple of months ago in the New York Times, there was an article in the real estate section, a repurposed church building as its big photo illustration. And it was a Lutheran church in the Chicago suburbs. So it starts with a woman returning to the place she was married to celebrate her 35th wedding anniversary. And then, of course, in graph 3, it reveals that the place is now a restaurant and she's going with her husband to have a festive meal. Now, I read that article and I thought, oh, all right, I'm glad they're not tearing these places down. And then I got further into the article, and a specialist on this part of American real estate said that 100,000 churches were going to close. And you know how you read a paragraph and you're sort of anticipating where the paragraph's going to go. And I thought she was going to say by 2050 or by the end of the century. By 2030, 100,000 Protestant churches are going to close. And she said that, well, that was kind of a challenge because these buildings have very special needs as buildings, but also are very unusual places to convert into any other use. A great big room with a really high ceiling and a lot of antiques is not necessarily something that's easily made into a bunch of condos. But that number was shocking. 100,000 Protestant churches by the end of this decade. That's just about half over.
I was actually quoted that article, by the way, and they were asking about my church and how we closed. Let's just say this. There's no manual out there on how to close a church building. It's like, how much is it worth? So we got an appraisal on the place, and the guy looked at us with like he's like, how do I appraise a building like this? What are the comps? And so like he looked at commercial buildings in like a 5-county region, and he gave us a number, which is $400,000. Our building was 14,000 square feet, set on 7.5 acres. The rebuild cost, according to the insurance company, was $1.3 million. To build it today, to buy the acreage and build the building that we had, would probably be around $1.5 to $2 million. And the best offer we got, cash offer we got for the building was $150,000. Even in rural America right now, we had a developer call. And he started the conversation. I said, sir, I appreciate you reaching out, but I don't want to know where the rest of this conversation is going to go. Because I know what he wanted to do was buy the acreage and then tear the building down and build a subdivision or a commercial development or something like that. And that was our last option. We wanted the building to go to something that we thought was adjacent to what we were doing. So in our case, what happened was we actually gave our building to a Christian school that had started in our community, and they outgrew their space in their current church and wanted to go to a bigger space. And we gave them the building, and all the maintenance and upkeep was their responsibility, and they let us stay there and worship on the weekends because they had school Tuesday through Friday, and we were there on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, and we just paid them a small stipend every month. It actually ended up working out really well for us because we got to stay where we were. Even if someone wrote us a check for $150,000 or $200,000, we had to go find some place to worship, and that wouldn't have been easy. So it actually ended up being a good situation. We had it lucky, though, because we're one of the first churches in Mount Vernon to close down. But what if you're the 5th church or the 7th church or the 9th church, and you're not in a good location commercially, and you're not in a great building structurally? Like, those buildings are going to become a problem for someone. And probably local government is going to have to bear the burden of these empty buildings. That's something they're not thinking about right now is, are you going to try to sell the building? You're going to sell it to? Who's going to do the maintenance and the upkeep in the meantime? Who's going to tear it down if it's a non-viable building? All those things cost money and time and headaches. And I don't think a lot of people are really thinking about just the real estate side of the decline of religion.
Along with not thinking about the real estate side of it, I wonder if secular civic authorities are thinking about a post-church world where my county, where my town lives without all that unpaid labor, without all that communal energy, without all the helping that goes on as a natural outgrowth of church work that will disappear when congregations disappear.
Oh, I think we have an invisible social safety net in America. We have the social safety net of Medicaid and Social Security and TANF and WIC and all these programs to help people out. But below that program is churches who do things like clothes closets and food pantries and soup kitchens and after-school tutoring and all those other things. And what we know in America is we're not going to dramatically expand the social safety net. We're not going to be Sweden. We're not that way. So if churches recede and the social safety net doesn't expand, the holes in that net are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And who are the people that are going to fall through those holes? The addicted, the depressed, the single mother, the poor. The people that the church really should care about the most are the ones that are going to be hurt the most by the decline in religion. And we're going to look in 20 or 30 years and go, man, why are things so tough right now? And I think a lot of things we're seeing, like the mental health crises we're seeing in America, those are people that used to be served by religion by and large, and now there's fewer and fewer resources to serve those people. And you know who it's falling on? It's falling on the police and the EMTs and the fire department and the local school system to try to fill all those holes in the social safety net. We're just seeing the leading edge of, I think, a coming social crisis in America, where lots of people who would have been lifted up by religious organizations are going to fall through the cracks, and someone's going to have to deal with these problems. And the last 5 or 10 years has taught us the government is not good at dealing with a lot of these problems. So we're going to be worse off as a society.
Even places that are, I guess a lot of people don't really think it through. Even a lot of places that are not serving only their co-religionists began as places that were created by religious impulse, whether it's the YMCA or Catholic Charities, or Lutheran Social Services, or the local Catholic hospital, or those after-school programs that you're mentioning, feeding programs. I'm not precluding the possibility that it could evolve, but right now there's no vessel, a secular vessel, that creates the impulse to pull people together to do that kind of work, the kind of work that created the Y in the 19th century. There is no secular equivalent yet. And until there is one, we might be caught between two stools, phasing out one version of America, that 19th century do-good social gospel idea that got us through the next century, and then nothing to take its place right now.
Oh, I think that's the issue is, will the secular community rise up and build a social safety net that rivals what religion's built for the last 250 years in America? And I get asked about this all the time. Atheists say, do you think I'm defective in my worldview? And I go, listen, I'm not going to get into theology. Obviously, my theology differs from your theology. What I'll say is defective is the fact that you guys don't join stuff. You don't volunteer. You don't donate. And unless and until you can create organizations that rival what major denominations in America have done, I'm going to say that's a net negative for American society. The data says, by the way, that atheists are just as inclined to volunteer and just as inclined to donate as religious people. They just don't have the mechanisms to do those things. They don't have the plate passing in front of them every week. They don't have a church that says, hey, we have a food pantry. Would you like to help on Saturday? They don't. We know that people are inclined to volunteer. It's just religion provides the plumbing, the infrastructure that makes those things happen. So when that infrastructure goes away, when religion declines, there is going to be no infrastructure unless someone else steps in and starts building it. And I've not seen anything in the secular community that comes even close to what one major denomination in America has done in the last 200 years. Not saying it can't happen, it just hasn't happened yet.
Well, it seems like there's no intellectual, there is no propositional thing that people agree on that makes them come out of their houses to be in each other's faces to do a shared task. There's no organizational principle, let's say.
I think the rise in non-religions also caught up in the rise of us not joining things. To go back to Robert Putnam's bowling alone idea, we're just not joining stuff. And I will say this, the atheist community has tried to create something called Sunday Assembly, which was like this church without Jesus thing. And it blew up in America. There was tons of them in major metros like Chicago and LA and Nashville and New York. And over time, most of them closed up shop. And one of the reasons they did was because they had a hard time fundraising because they were afraid to pass the plate because it felt too much like religion. But the thing is, like, the reason religion endures is because it understands you have to do the good stuff and the hard stuff. Like, asking for money is part of how to make this whole social organization work. You can't just strip out the parts from an organization you like and get rid of the other parts. It just doesn't work that way. And so I think that they're learning. I think the atheist community is learning of how to recreate community, but I don't think they're there yet. We're in this gap of in between, right? Where all these institutions that our parents and grandparents use to make meaning and purpose and help them volunteer and help the community are declining, and they're not being replaced with anything yet. And so I think a lot of millennials and Gen Z go, I want to serve. I want to do good things. I want to help the world. I just don't know how to do that practically. When our parents had churches that, hey, do you want to help with the clothes closet? Come on and help on Thursdays. That's the logistical thing is the bigger problem here.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, more from my conversation with Ryan Burge and the death of polite religion. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. But is there also a reputational problem? Opinion research among young Americans shows that that's not what they associate with membership in a religious organization. One organization went out and asked young Americans what the words that come to mind that they associate with just religion. And they said judgmental, anti-gay, hypocritical. 8 out of the 10 most named words were negative words. They're not saying, feeding the poor and lifting up the sick and cheering the lonely. They're talking about politics. Politics seem to have been like jet fuel for the church at one time. It doesn't seem to be that way now.
Yeah, young people have no concept of religion, especially white young people have no concept of religion that's not conservative. The one thing I have to do in the classroom is say, do you guys realize like all the things that religion did, like all the major social movements that were religious social movements in America, things like the abolitionist movement with slavery were driven by white Protestants in the North saying that slavery was antithetical to the gospel. And then, you go into the social gospel movement, which we talked about before. Like that was driven by a lot of pastors looking around New York City and go, this is awful. We should try to meet people where they are and feed them and work on sanitation. And you know what they fought for? Things like child labor laws and OSHA and overtime rules and unions, a way to make life a little less terrible for people working in the factories in New York City. And then we saw the civil rights movement, which was driven by religious fervor. We forget the fact that Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor. And if you read his sermons, they were imbued with religious imagery. And if you hear the people talk about when they were walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they said they prayed to God the dogs would not bite them. And they didn't bite them. There's something supernatural about religion and social movements, but in my generation, the only social movement we know when it comes to religion is the religious right. There is no left religious movement in America today. So I think that sort of spoiled a lot of young people thinking like religion has to be conservative. And if they're left of center politically, they go, well, the Christian church in America, especially the white Christian church in America, is anti-gay, it's anti-trans, it's anti-abortion, it's anti-women pastors. And I don't want anything to do with that, not realizing that the largest expression of American Christianity was the main line, which was none of those things. And they're dying. So I just wonder if the problem is they don't understand there's an alternative out there. It's like to be a Christian is to be a Republican is what they think, not realizing there used to be a lot of Christians who are Democrats doing a lot of good social things in America. They just don't see that anymore because those churches are declining, they're older, they're smaller, and they're less impactful culturally because of that.
So is this a single direction event now in American history, or is there some coming back from this?
Well, to use an overused word, this is unprecedented, what we're seeing in American life right now. So we saw the nuns rise from 5% of America in 1991 to 30% of America in 2020. But the share of Americans who are non-religious has actually stayed stable the last 3 or 4 years. So the nuns have stopped rising in America. Now, what we know is that'll be temporary because older people are dying and they're more religious and they're being replaced by younger people coming of age who are less religious. So there will be a continued rise in the nuns. But I do think we've hit this interesting inflection point where I think a lot of young people, you want to rebel against what your parents are up to. And for my generation and older generations, your parents were Christians, evangelicals, a lot of them. So the most rebellious thing to do is to become an atheist or a non-religious person. But imagine you're a second-generation atheist family or a third-generation atheist family. The most rebellious thing you can do is be religious. And so I do wonder if the pendulum swings the other way a little bit. And we're seeing, by the way, a rise. Younger men are not leaving religion as fast as younger women are. But the kind of religion they're being drawn to is the kind of far-right religion that might be problematic from a democratic perspective. Things like, white evangelicalism or traditional Catholicism that rejects Vatican II and wants to have a Latin Mass and all those things. So the
and
kind
Eastern
of
Orthodoxy, surprisingly.
Yes, Orthodoxy is growing very quickly. It's like hard religion is growing, not easy religion. And I think that's really interesting because it's like we're not just going to course correct. We're going to course correct all the way to the other side of the theological political spectrum in America. So I think that to me is a mixed bag. You know what I mean? Is religion returning? I go, yeah, but not the kind of religion that most people would really appreciate. The kind of polite religion of yesteryear is not what's coming back. It's the virulent religion. It's the I'm right and you're wrong. I'm not going to compromise kind of religion, which is good for religion, but bad for democracy because it doesn't seek pluralistic solutions to problems. It says my way or the highway.
My daughter is an ordained person, and the week before her ordination, she said to me, almost musing, who's going to be out there in 2050? Is there somebody out there in 2050? She is a mainline priest in the Episcopal Church, going strictly by the numbers, not looking good for the rest of the 21st century.
There will be people out there. I'm completely convinced of that, but there'll not be a whole lot of mainline Protestants out there. The share of Americans who are mainline Protestants in the ages of 18 and 40 is now 2% of America. People ask me to do analysis of like, what are young mainliners up to? And I'm like, I can't do it because there's not enough in the sample. They're a rare bird. I remember every time I'd go to like an associational meeting with ABC, I'd look around and try to find anyone who was within 10 years of me. We'd like run to each other like polar bears, like on the ice caps. Like there's not many of us left. I think the problem is the kind of churches that I want to go to and your daughter wants to pastor are the kind of churches that are not going to exist outside of major metropolitan areas. Like I still think there's going to be a lot of Episcopalian churches in like New York City and New Jersey and Boston and places like that. But in rural America, places where I live, there are a total of 4 mainline churches left in my entire county, and 2 of them don't have pastors right now. And the third one's an Episcopal church with 8 people on a Sunday because I went there a couple months ago and was like, holy cow. The only one that really exists is the church I go to, which is First United Methodist. It's the last large-ish mainline church. It has about 200 people. So like, I really do think in lots of counties like mine, there's going to be one mainline church in the entire county when there might be 30 or 40 or 60 evangelical churches in those counties. And so I think that creates a real problem for folks like me. And by the way, I don't think I'm alone. That we want to express our Christian faith, but not that way. not in the evangelical way of our youth. We still love the gospel and love Jesus and love the theology and the beauty of the church, but don't want it to be about politics all the time and don't want it to be about exclusion, that want to focus on inclusion and forgiveness and reconciliation. I want to go to a church that calls me to be a better version of myself every Sunday. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people who are in my boat who will become nuns by default because they can't find a church that they don't hate theologically and politically. And I think that's the thing I worry about the most is it's not like people are leaving religion. They don't have a choice in a lot of these places. Religion works well when it gives people options. It's a buffet, right? You can go left, right, and center. You can go Orthodox, you can go Jewish, you can go Hindu and Muslim. And most of America is going to be one note or two notes in the future, which is evangelical, Catholic, or none. That's really going to be your options.
Is the assignment now in 2025 about to be decentering Sunday morning in the case of Christians, Saturday morning in the case of dwindling Jewish congregations, Friday in the case of Muslims who are very healthy and growing in many places, and making liturgy, making worship part of the experience, but not always the main event? Should we be making religion a different kind of proposition to people who are, let's say, curious, so that it is not only a whole heart event, but a whole hand event and a whole head event, where it's not just worship on the traditional worship time of your religious organization?
Mm-hmm. There's a great quote from this Christian author named Philip Yancey. He said, "No one became a Christian because they lost the argument." And I think that's the problem is we've tried to appeal to apologetics for the last 50 or 75 years. We can convince people through good theology and good preaching to become Christians. And the reality is that almost no people come to church because of the preaching or because of the theology. What they come for, and I wrote a book about this called The Great De-Churching. The number one reason why people would come back to church who left church is because of friends. It's horizontal reasons. That's why they want to come. That's why they want to stay. They want to find new friends. Their friends are going, or their children's friends are going. That's what they want to be a part of. The community is salvific in many ways. When I gave my last sermon at First Baptist, I said, if my children are Christians when they're adults, it's not because of anything I said from this pulpit. Probably that pushed them farther away than brought them in. What would bring them in is the fact that you loved them and you cared about them and you bought them Christmas presents and birthday presents, and the fact that whenever we came home from the hospital with our youngest son, people in the church had put pot roast and chili on our front step for us to have something to eat. Like, that is the church. And that is what is going to show them the value of that community. Pastors think everything's vertical. I think everything's horizontal. The social aspect of religion has been almost abandoned. So what I tell churches is find ways to be social without any theological trappings, right? No praise band, no evangelistic sermon. Have a barbecue. And you know how long people stay? For as long as they want. They can eat as much as they want. They can talk as much as they want. They can build connections with people as much as they want, because in a society where we're more atomized and fragmented, guess what? The church can be a meeting place, which it always was, by the way, a meeting place for people from every walk of life. And then they go worship together on Sunday if they want to. But the people are what keep you in the pews, not the pastor, not the theology.
In the story that America tells itself about itself, would it be a good idea to raise the alarm, to be very, very upfront about the trouble the church is in, capital T, capital C, instead of hiding behind optimism and maybe we're about to turn a corner or whatever? I think the church as an institution has such a big cultural footprint that probably a lot of people don't realize at scale, in a country of 335 million people, just what trouble it is in as an institution. It covers over its problems with the foundation by being such a big player. There's the guy who's going to be the next president of the United States with 15 pastors with their hands on his shoulder, and a faith and values conference that every big politician feels like he has to go to, and a Speaker of the House who keeps alluding to biblical passages and Old Testament stories. Does that kind of thing cover up, paper over just what trouble the larger institution of Christianity is in.
I think the argument the church is declining has only resonated amongst church people for a long, long time. It's like, I've written books about this, and you know who buys it? Pastors and denominational leaders and concerned Christians. I just finished a manuscript of a book right now called The Big Church Sort. The title I gave was called The Death of Polite Religion and the Future of America. And I want to make an argument that the church is declining, and that's not just bad for church people, that's bad for democracy. Like, I think we need to make this bigger argument. Like, that's a problem. It's not like people aren't going to heaven. It's like democracy's harder because we don't get along anymore. We don't have bonding social capital, to use a Robert Putnam term. I think we need to make this bigger argument that the decline of religion will affect every single one of us, whether you like it or not. And religion provides a really important role in a functioning democracy. Like, let's be real about this. American democracy has consisted and persisted for decades, largely because of what religion provides in providing the social capital and the social safety net that we talked about. You get rid of that, and what do we have? We have nothing but tribalism. And we cannot function in a society where we have tribes on all these different sides who peek out every once in a while to say how awful the other tribes are. Like, we cannot exist in a pluralistic democracy without compromise. And you know where people learn how to compromise? In organizations like religion. Religion provides all these good things. People think about religion in terms of vertical things, salvation and Jesus. I think about religion in terms of building civic skills and bridging social capital and developing the ability to participate in the political process. Like, all those things are incredibly important. And when they go away, we're going to sit around and go, man, that was awful. We should have not let that happen. What I've been telling people is, even if you don't believe, you should go. And you should show up because of all the other value it will provide in your life. And you might believe later on and you might not. I think that's irrelevant to the conversation because I'm not making a Christian argument. I'm making a democracy argument, which we all should care about.
Millions of young Americans, and I'll throw anybody under 40 into that pot, will tell you that they're not anti-religious. Many millions of them will say, I have some spiritual life, but I'm not religious. The word religion has a crummy, radioactive charge on it, for want of a better term. They will describe themselves in ways that might have at another time in our history sure sounded very religious, but they'll never use that R word to describe themselves. Is that a mission field? Is that a portion of the population where at least you've got something to work with?
I tell people I'm religious, not spiritual.
Me too.
Yeah, like
me too.
I'm a believer in institutions, though. Like, I'm a trained political scientist, and we learned the value of institutions and what holds society together during our worst moment were institutions, including religion. And here's the problem: is our institutions awful? Yeah, but because we're awful. You know what I mean? Like, we can't expect imperfect people to create perfect institutions, but Tony Campolo said the solution to bad religion is not no religion, it's better religion. Like, the solution to bad institutions is not no institutions, it's better institutions. I think we've got to build up what built us up. Russell Brand, who I don't like at all, made this really interesting. He's become a Christian. He had like a conversion experience, whatever. But he said something really important, I think, which is, he goes, why did I think I was so much more clever than my parents and grandparents? And I think that's what I want to tell young people is, why do you think that, like, what got them through the Great Depression and World War II and the Civil Rights Movement and 9/11 and all these things, that you don't need that? You need something. You need it. Now, whether it be religion or not, that's up to you personally. I don't think everyone has a God-shaped hole. I think a lot of people do that don't realize it, but I don't think it's everybody. You need something to fill that hole in your life that gives you fulfillment and peace and purpose. What is the thing that gives you purpose? And if you can't answer that, then you need to find something, because I think we're going through an existential crisis in America right now. And religion used to provide some of the guardrails and some of the moorings that helped us have purpose and have meaning. And now when we've torn down all these institutions, we're standing there in the rubble of what we've destroyed going, why is everything awful? Well, because the things that built America have been destroyed by you and your perception of the world. Religion is a cause of and a solution to many of the things facing us in America today. We're just not willing to hear people say that.
After working really hard to stave off the inevitable, the time came when the decision was made to finally close your church. Was there a catalytic moment, a border that was crossed where you said, we just can't do this anymore?
In January of 2024, we did not meet for a month. I got sick. Our pianist broke her shoulder, and it got really cold. And we decided to not meet Sunday after Sunday. And then when we got back, it was like any motivation that we still had, any enthusiasm that we'd built up, it just been deflated. And we sort of got together and said, let's not do anything until after Easter's over. So we went through Lent, we went through Easter. And the Sunday after Easter, we met. We had a business meeting. In the meeting, I had thought this business meeting over in my head for 10 years now, how it was going to go. The whole thing lasted 15 minutes. It was one thing we voted on, which was not if we're going to close, what date we were going to close was the only question that was really on the table. And we picked the date that was closest to our anniversary, which was in 1868. Our church was founded in July. That's why we picked the date that we did. It was a moment where I think a lot of us were relieved that we didn't have to deal with that anymore. That moment had passed, and now it was just the logistics of closing down. It's like a death, though. It really is like a death. I mean, it feels like a grieving process. And I think many of us are still going through that grieving process. And what gives me hope is the fact that when I went to the Methodist church 2 Sundays after we closed, I sat in the same pew with 3 members of my church, of the old church that closed down. And when we said the creed, it was exactly the same. And we said the Lord's Prayer, it was exactly the same. Like, that might have closed, but what we were and what we are is not over with. We will carry it through just in a different situation. And it feels weird and it feels awkward because I'm not a Methodist. I'm a Baptist in my core. But man, when I say the doxology, when I say the creed, when we sing the hymns, when I hear the sermon, I'm still building the kingdom of God just in a different way.
Okay, so there's enough to build on there.
Yeah, of course. I am both pessimistic and optimistic every day of my life. And that's the tension that I have to live in, right? I was always told as a pastor, you have to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And I think that's my life, right? Like, is finding enough data to make me really depressed and then finding a ray of hope somewhere in some data that goes, okay, things aren't as bad as we thought they were.
Well, you have your other life as an academic. So I guess now that you're not actively pastoring anymore, there's still a tie to that world through your scholarly work?
This is the extension of my ministry. It was always weird when I would go to speak to 500 people on a Saturday, then fly home and then preach to 8 people on a Sunday. But now I have more time to do the bigger things that impact more, that write the books, that do the podcasts, that do the interviews, that really try to impact the discourse. Like, I think I'm still a pastor, just in a different way now. I don't have a local church anymore, and I preach every once in a while, but I still feel like I have a pulpit. And I still feel like I have something to say, and I still feel like academics, we need to make our points known and know that we have a point of view about these things, and I think the data points to this as well. So I'm still preaching the gospel just in a slightly more academic way now.
As someone who's done a lot of reporting on this stuff, my big question going ahead, and I'll be interested in hearing what you have to say about this, is whether the new populations that are building Sikh gurdwaras and mosques, both in suburbs and in center cities, and building Hindu temples, enormous, ornate Hindu temples with big parking lots, whether they become more like other Americans or keep their little light shining in a very distinct and different way that doesn't necessarily follow the trajectory of American religion in the late 20th and early 21st century.
Assimilation is almost impossible to reject. If you came here, you brought all your culture with you, but then your children look around and go, Dad, most of my kids don't go to temple. Like, they don't go to church. They don't go anywhere. And I want to be like them. And so what the data says is that every generation is less religious than the prior generation amongst immigrant families. So if I'm first generation, second generation, I look almost exactly like my peers look like. And I do think there's something to be said for the distinctiveness of like smaller religious groups like Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims. And they're going to be able to maintain a little bit more of a community because they stand so much apart from a larger American culture. But I still think the forces of assimilation are just going to wash over them in a way where, unless they continue to have massive amounts of immigration, which is probably going to be curtailed in the next 4 years, they're not going to be able to sustain the numbers they're losing based on those second and third generation people not coming to temple or mosque, because that's just not what their generation does.
Well, recently I interviewed a Lebanese-born Episcopal priest who is rewriting a version of the Book of Common Prayer in Arabic. And I thought, oh, Cool, good for you. And he worships in the church whose cornerstone was laid by Mrs. Henry Ford in Dearborn, Michigan. I was at a Hindu temple in Frisco, Texas on a Tuesday night that was just jam-packed, and people of all ages, and American-born people and Indian-born people, and I thought, oh, this is lively and happening and hot. And all the kids were in a Sanskrit class so they could learn the Bhagavad Gita, and the adults were in the various sub-temples inside, and I thought, this looks promising. The parking lot was full. That was great. And I was in the largest Catholic church in the Archdiocese of L.A., which has 25,000 people on the rolls, and 10 masses on Sunday, 9 in Spanish and 1 in English. And the only reason the English one was filled with people who also speak Spanish, but they just knew that it was easier to get a seat in that one. And I thought, well, I guess I could keep setting my hair on fire and keep being really depressed about all this, but this stuff cumulatively looks pretty good.
To me, it's the bigger question is, are Americans going to reject that because it's not traditional Christianity? There's still even anti-Catholicism in America today. The conceit of the book, by the way, is the idea that we're seeing the melding of Catholicism and evangelicalism and even Muslims in some ways because they agree on culture war issues. They're going to put aside the theology stuff. There was a book ban conversation in Michigan, and evangelicals stood up in favor of book bans, but right behind them in line were Muslims standing up in favor of book bans too. And so I think what they're going to find is the enemy is my friend. And so I disagree with Muslims on everything in terms of theology, but if we vote the same way, then we're good. And so I think it's going to tribalize us even more. The racial conversation shoots all the way through the religious conversation. What we know is that 16% of Americans were non-white Christians in 1972. It's 16% of Americans non-white Christians today. The reason Christianity is declining is because white Christianity is declining. And that's a problem for white people. They want to see their old way of life be held together. And the reality is they're being replaced every day, and religiously they're changing every day. And I think we're in this weird transition of what we used to be for 200 years is not what we're going to be 100 years from now. And a lot of people have a hard time with change. Maybe myself included on that. I don't know. But I think that how we navigate the transition from what we were to what we're going to be is going to dictate how, religion's impacted society, culture, politics, all of it.
Ryan Burge, thanks a lot. Thanks for your generosity with your time. Great to talk to you.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.